Well, coming now is a true pioneer of the values voter movement as a leading spokesman for pro-life, pro-family, and pro-growth values in America. He was Chief Domestic Policy Advisor to President Ronald Reagan, President of the Family Research Council, Senior Vice President of Focus on the Family, and in 2000 he ran for President of the United States of America. Today he serves as Chairman of Campaign for Working Families PAC, dedicated to electing conservative candidates to Congress, and as President of American Values, featuring his end-of-day email briefing, which is a must-read, by the way, for every values voter. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming to the stage Gary Bauer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How nice of you. Thank you. Really appreciate that. I told you this before. Ronald Reagan once told me that if I was ever introduced and got a standing ovation, I'd have sit down immediately because I had nowhere to go but down after that. So you've already put me on the spot. Gil, thanks for the wonderful introduction. That voice, what line did you have to get in to get that voice? I would have loved to have that voice. Great to be here at the Values Voter Summit, as it always is. Here we are in the 6th year of the disaster euphemistically known as the Obama years. I remember last year and the year before, we met here worried about losing our health care, and this year we're meeting worried about losing our heads. It doesn't seem like we're on the right path, folks. Look, I got a bunch of jokes I'd like to tell, but it's a serious time, so I'm going to get serious real quick. We're in deep, deep trouble. We're in tremendous danger. When I say we, I don't mean just the United States. I mean Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization. I think this is a moment in our history probably nearly unprecedented because we're not aware yet. We're not fully awake about what we're facing. If we survive, it will be due to the mercy of God and His protective hand, and it will be because men and women like you rise to the occasion. And if those two things don't happen, friends, then Katie barred the door. I think anything is possible. Just a few weeks ago, we marked the 13th anniversary of the attack on 9/11. It's kind of hard to believe, 13 years already. Even though it's been 13 years, I bet every one of you could tell me where you were that morning if you were old enough, right? I was sitting next to the Pentagon that morning, driving into Washington, D.C., when I heard the unnaturally loud roar of the jet engine of that hijacked plane that just seconds later crashed into the side of the Pentagon, the blast literally moving my car. I'd find out later that at that very moment, friends of mine died both on the plane and at their desk in the Pentagon. In the weeks and months that followed, particularly in those days right after the event, do you remember what you did? I was watching TV nonstop. I wanted to get every bit of information I could. Why did this happen? Who did it? Was it the first blow or were more coming? And I remember in that first 24 hours being heartened because when I turned on the TV, I saw crowds in Berlin, in London, in Paris, in Tokyo, all over the world, bringing flowers to American embassies, sharing their sorrow with us. I remember the scenes out of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. People weeping with us, Israelis declaring a day of mourning with us, lowering their flag along with us lowering ours. And they did that, of course, because even though they hadn't experienced the 9/11 event, not one event like that, they had been through these grinding campaigns of terror time and time again. And when you add up all the broken bones and all the ripped flesh and all the spilled blood, Israelis had actually suffered worse casualties than we did on that morning. And so they knew exactly what we were living through. I also remember some other images that I saw, and they made me angry. In Gaza and in the West Bank, people running out of their homes, celebrating, dancing in the street, handing out candy to their children, shooting guns in the air. We hadn't even pulled the bodies out of the wreckage, and they were celebrating our pain and suffering. Every time some reporter asks me, Gary, why do you conservatives support Israel? I remind them of that day and who cried with us and who celebrated our pain and suffering. In the days that followed 9/11, we saw all sorts of images. It wasn't long after that Daniel Pearl, remember him, the Wall Street Journal reporter, captured by jihadists, tormented on videotape, made to look into a camera and say over and over again, I am a Jew, before they decapitated him and sent the video of his severed head all over the Middle East as a recruiting tool. That's what they're doing now. What kind of evil is this that wallows in its bloodthirstiness? And since then, we've seen more beheadings. We've seen the bombings in London and Madrid and Boston. We've seen U.S. soldiers mowed down, not in Afghanistan and Iraq, but at Fort Hood in the United States where they're supposed to be safe. Outrageous. The Obama administration referred to it as workplace violence. There's breaking news today, my friends, out of Oklahoma. And if you've heard yet or not, a recent convert to Islam, trying to convert his co-workers, his boss warned him, you can't do that on the job. He continued doing it. They fired him. He came back to work and cut off the head of a 54-year-old woman. The story's breaking today. We've seen Christians murdered across the Middle East and large swaths of Africa. I don't remember any emergency meetings at the United Nations. We've seen Christian girls kidnapped and sold into sex slavery. Nuns raped and beheaded. Did you see the story? You had to look for it really closely about 3 weeks ago. 3 nuns, I think it was in Angola. 2 of them 70 years old, 1 of them 80. Raped first and then beheaded. Local authorities say they have no idea who did it or what the motive could have been. But I know it couldn't have anything to do with Islam because the president told me. Here in the United States, synagogues spray painted with swastikas in Miami. In Indiana, about a month ago, somebody writing on 3 or 4 church walls verses from the Quran calling for the killing of the infidel. I saw an interview on local TV in Indiana. It was either a pastor or a priest from one of the churches. And the man was befuddled. He said, "What? Is this some sort of prank? I mean, is this an effort to turn the local community against our Muslim neighbors? Is there really somebody in Indiana that thinks we're all infidels and have to be killed? Sir, turn on your television set." Meanwhile, in Iran, the Muslims who run that country believe that we are on the verge of seeing the great Muslim Messiah return to the world. He's supposed to come out of a well in Iran. And we'll know him because he will conduct a great slaughter of Christians and Jews. In fact, in the Quran it says, when this Messiah comes, Jews will hide behind trees and rocks, and the trees will shout out, "The Jew is hiding behind me, come and kill him." And these people are marching day by day toward nuclear weapons. And my friends, it's not just the jihadists, which would be bad enough. Putin's Russia is on the march. If a year ago somebody would have told you, in the next year you'll see a civilian aircraft shot down over the skies of Europe, either by Russians or their operatives, everybody on board will be killed from a dozen nations, and the bodies will lie in fields rotting for days. The president was very upset about this. He sent a team of investigators to get to the bottom who did this, to collect evidence. Apparently, somebody forgot to tell the Russian thugs that they were supposed to let Obama's investigators have access to the crash scene. You know, the president does this all the time, send investigators. This would be like FDR being told about Harry Truman and saying, I want the names of every one of those pilots. Let's track them down and put them on trial. You know, Obama and Kerry constantly respond to this by saying, this is the 21st century. People don't do things. Nations don't do things like this anymore. Well, they just did it. The question before us is not whether nations and thugs still do these things. The question before us is, what are free men and women going to do? And what are our leaders going to do other than playing golf? President Obama says this repeatedly: the 21st century does not belong to those that destroy and kill. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, nobody's claimed the 21st century yet. There's nothing written in stone about the 21st century. It started a little rocky, you know, with 9/11. Let me tell you, there was nothing that was determined ahead of time. By the 20th century, there was nothing written in stone about Nazism and communism and whether they would win or we would win. The history was written by strong men of both parties, men like FDR and Truman and JFK and Ronald Reagan, who rose to the occasion. And we won for another reason, because those presidents and the American people and our cultural elites knew that this civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization, Western civilization, is worth defending. Today, while our leaders show weakness abroad, Obama and his allies do everything they can to rip out of our society all the vestiges that made this Judeo-Christian civilization. Our belief that liberty comes from God, that it has to be ordered liberty, it has to be based in virtue. That's what made us different, and that's what the liberal elites of this country can't stand. Ladies and gentlemen, I know nobody likes to talk directly about these things. I'm under no such obligation to avoid speak truthing. We've got a president today more interested in defending the reputation of Islam than he does in saving the lives of Christians. Thank you. You know, he said that in a speech in Cairo. He said, I consider one of the responsibilities of my office as president to defend Islam from unfair and scurrilous attacks. Wouldn't you love to see the next Republican nominee actually have a heart and a brain and say to him, Mr. President, when Obama was in office, for 8 years, I could never find where in his job description defending Islam against scurrilous attacks was. I thought he was supposed to defend the United States of America, but that's just me, This speech this past week at the UN, people were praising that speech, and I guess it's because if you hear pablum all the time, if every once in a while there's something with a little meat to it, you get all excited. But the speech was filled with platitudes. Listen to this. This is directly from the speech. The shadow of world war that existed at the founding of the United Nations has been lifted. No, it hasn't. It's the exact opposite. The possibility of a world war is growing. It's not shrinking, and it's growing because of the instinctive weakness of President Obama. Our enemies... Our enemies are emboldened, and our friends don't trust us, and they're demoralized. Look, let me run you real quick through Obama's foreign policy. Just some of the highlights. The apology tour. He began the administration with the apology tour. We saved the world from communism and Nazism, but apparently the president thought we needed to give the world an apology for something. I still haven't figured it out. Remember the Iranian dissidents? Didn't lift a finger for him. There were even leaks out of the White House saying, this really complicates our efforts to reach out to the Iranian government. I mean, this instability couldn't come at a worse time. But when the pro-American government of Egypt got in trouble, what did the president do? Pulled the rug out from underneath that government as quickly as he could and turned it over to the tender mercies of the wolves of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's what he did. He and his Secretary of State left our men to die in Benghazi. And by the way, Mrs. Clinton, you're not going to get a free ride on this. You can't implement the policies and then run as if you were opposed to the policies. We're going to call you out. The president regularly berates our friends in Israel for building homes for Israeli Jews in Jerusalem. Jews were living in Jerusalem, ladies and gentlemen, when Washington, D.C. was still a swamp. Well, that's no big deal, I mean, because Washington, D.C. is a swamp today. But the president said this. Well, first of all, he's the most anti-Israel president, narrowly winning the title away from Jimmy Carter, by the way. I always love reminding Jimmy Carter, whenever I get a chance, that the first family of Christendom were all Jews. I mean, Mary and Joseph, they were Jews, and the disciples were all Jews, and that famous biblical figure, John the Baptist, was not a Baptist, he was a Jew. So, good grief, my time's running out. I'm just getting warmed up here. Okay, so here's what the president said. And the violence engulfing the region today has made too many Israelis ready to abandon the hard work of peace. He actually said that at the UN. My friends, nobody wants peace more than the Israelis. But you got to have a peace partner, right? And they have not abandoned the cause of peace. They have abandoned the possibility that the President of the United States will ever end his hostility toward them and begin to stand up and defend the most reliable ally the United States ever had. When Boko Haram killed Christians in churches, which they did and continue to do every Sunday, the president's protest is such a whisper. You've got to be on the same putting green he is to hear what he's saying. When Christian girls were abducted and sold into sex slavery, the Obama administration's response was hashtag bring back our girls. And guess what, folks? It ends up that hashtags and selfies, remember the First Lady holding that picture, taking the picture of herself so she could send out the hashtag, bring back our girls? That's not a foreign policy. I don't see the girls, and I hate to imagine what they have been subjected to while we've been doing selfies and sending out hashtags. And then there was that moment when Obama leaned over to Russian President Medvedev and said, tell Vladimir Putin, tell Vlad, I'll be a lot more flexible after the election. Now, Putin got his flexibility, and the people of Ukraine got the stiff boot of a Russian soldier on their necks. Not a very good deal there. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is that at this very moment, in all sorts of places around the world, there are evil men, many of them who brag that they worship death, and they are feverishly, seriously, intently working on ways to bring to you and yours sorrows greater than the sorrows we've already experienced. Does anybody think Barack Obama is up to the challenge? Of course not. So look, let me leave you with this. We've got our problems, but there is still a deep reservoir in this country of the values that were at our founding. It's still there. It's hard to see sometimes, and I'm telling you, it's there, and it's much more powerful than we think. It needs leadership. On the morning of 9/11, I won't go through a complete description, but just think about one or two things. The policemen and firemen that ran into the World Trade Center towers, even though in many cases their officers were yelling at them, don't go in, the buildings could collapse. It didn't matter. They went in to save people like you. The folks on that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, not Marines, not Navy SEALs. They were businessmen going on an early morning trip, students going back to college, families going on vacation. They were in the middle of a nightmare. The pilot and co-pilot dead, several flight attendants murdered, a Jewish passenger killed by the guy sitting next to him who was one of the hijackers. The passengers go to the back of the plane. What are we going to do? An argument breaks out. Some say, sit back down. Others say, we've got to fight back. They disagree. Somebody says, let's vote. Oh, I love that. On the day they attack our constitutional republic, what do Americans do? They vote. Everybody in favor of fighting back, they raise their hands. Everybody in favor of taking seats. The ones that wanted to fight back won. And so they grabbed whatever they could as a makeshift weapon, and they got a drink cart, and they ran down the aisle of that airplane into the teeth of men armed with box cutters. Can you imagine what that scene must have looked like? And they brought that plane down and spared us greater suffering that morning. And then there's all the young men and women that answered the volunteer call and went off to Iraq and Afghanistan and fought as courageously as you could have ever asked them to do. And now watch our political leadership fritter away the gains they won with the blood of their brothers. And if that is not enough inspiration for you, there are the reports that have kept me awake the last couple of nights. Hard to confirm them all in the fog of war. You may have heard about them. That in northern Iraq today, ISIS has taken another Christian area, and they are going door to door in Christian homes, and they are grabbing the children, and they are telling those children as they put a knife to their neck, denounce Jesus or we will kill you. And we are getting reports from missionaries and others that in house after house there are dead Christian Iraqi children who will not deny their Savior. Ladies and gentlemen, love your God and your family. Stiffen your spine. Be of stout heart. Clear your mind. And get ready to do very difficult things. Because that is the only way we are going to save this precious nation, this glowing city on a hill. God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you. God bless you all. Never give up. Thank you.